Ladies and gentlemen, in this RedGamingTech.com video we're going to be further discussing the Xbox 720, and this time we're going to be focusing upon the software. Several sources have been stating that the Xbox is actually behind Sony in terms of development of the games. How much behind, I hear you cry? Well, apparently up to 6 months behind schedule with certain software, and indeed, Microsoft right now are trying to aggressively sign exclusive games exclusively for the next generation console. So, what exactly would be the reasons for them to be behind? Well, first of all, before we talk about that, let's also remember that Microsoft themselves are putting about the press conference, and Paul Furrett just the other day was giving information that one of the reasons for the delay in the press conference, and obviously about a month's delay, was to actually get stuff ready for the system. Now obviously you and I both know that they're not going to be able to make any major hardware revisions, so as I surmised yesterday's video, the most likely of changes would be for actual software. Now that could be operating system changes, but it could also be development time for various games. In other words, quite simply put, the titles were not at a ready state, and indeed this latest news definitely lends some credence to this. So what are the actual reasons for this? Well, apparently there are several. The primary one is the cancellation of several internal next-gen projects. Now you guys may be familiar with those, but internally Microsoft were apparently considering various different options along the way, and indeed there was an entertainment-only version of the console and various other bits and pieces. Don't forget as well, the next Xbox Mini is also in development, supposedly, also known as, of course, Stingray. And all of this stuff, combined with Microsoft's desire to take over some of the pie that Apple are enjoying right now with the TV services and various other bits and pieces, you can imagine just how much time this is starting to take. So, does that mean that we are in for any problems? Well, honestly speaking, it depends on how simple the operating system is and the actual kit is to develop for. Now, Amata is going to be producing another video to actually go into details of a next generation game, which is supposedly going to be a futuristic shooter from Respawn. It's supposedly supposed to be exclusive. Interestingly, however, it's being made by via, shall I say, a modified version of the Source engine. It's not internal EA technology whatsoever. However, the title is not going to look as good as something like Battlefield 4. Now, for those unfamiliar with the Source engine, it's been utilized in quite a few Valve games, as well as others. You would see this in, for example, Half-Life 2, or even Left 4 Dead, and so on. Indeed, versions of this Source engine have actually been used in other titles as well that are completely non-FPS-like, as engines tend to be. Just for example, the Unreal Engine isn't just for FPS, it has, of course, been used for something like Gears of War, and even Batman, Arkham City, and well, the Arkham games in general use a modified version of the Unreal Engine. So in this case, the Source has actually been used for even Vampire Bloodlines, I believe, but in this case, as I've said, it's being used on this next generation shooter. Now, Source itself, as I said, was fairly old. It was modified and created, shall I say, in about 2004. However, there have been significant revisions each and every time now. And obviously, Source has actually been working on other systems as well, but most likely, now that we're going to be using an x86-X64 based processor, it's going to be a lot easier for them to start doing ports. So, just how far behind are they? Well, as I said, they're about 6 months. Is that any cause for concern? Well, yes and no. To begin with, some viewers may remember certain rush jobs in console history. There are quite a few famous ones. Perhaps in my mind, the most famous rush jobs are actually from Sega back in the days of the 32-bit era. Now, for those unfamiliar with it, or you didn't own a Saturn, or you weren't around back then, what have you, Sega released several games actually that were part of the launch lineup. However, Sega decided to release the system early because they want to get a drop on Sony. But to do this, they basically didn't tell any of the developers that, by the way, we're actually releasing this system soon. And it was actually shortly after the announcement that the actual system went on sale. And because of this, there was actually some screw-ups, even in terms of localization, because back then, games weren't really developed with multi-region in mind. So, for example, if you are a European gamer or even an American gamer, believe it or not, America used to get the titles a lot sooner than Europe, mostly because of the NTSC and PAL differences. But even so, if you were to look at a title in a magazine that was Japanese and you were waiting for it to be converted into English, this is particularly true of titles that had quite a lot of text or voice acting, you would be waiting for a while because, quite simply put, they needed to translate it. So what actually happened with the Saturn's case is that you had a situation where each region would actually have various different games released because they hadn't had time to translate them, and to actually add salt into the wound and to then rip open that wound and then apply some vinegar in there as well. The games that were released, such as Virtua Fighter 1 and Daytona USA, they're two classic examples. They were not optimized heavily, and by which I mean they were actually pretty appalling. They played perfectly, and I loved the games to pieces, don't get me wrong. But if you were to take a look at Virtua Fighter 1 and then you go look at Virtua Fighter Remix, which is basically Virtua Fighter 1 should have looked like before they had to basically rush the title out. You can see an absolute massive disparity in between the two titles. Now, I'm not trying to say that, Microsoft's titles are going to be anywhere near that bad. Fortunately, there is what is known as patching now as well. However, it's definitely not in their favour. Now, fortunately, if the information on the two systems is accurate and they are both using x86 based processors, in fact more to the point, they're both using pretty much the same processor. We know that they're using both derivatives of the AMD Jaguar. However, there probably is some differences before anyone asks. I don't know all the specifics. I have seen some internal documents on the AMD Jaguar for the Xbox Durango. Hopefully I'll be able to put that video out today. But since some of the information is still unknown, A, and B, we don't know some of the modifications that Sony themselves have made. Remember, they were working in tandem with AMD to be able to put out some of the changes and revisions for the PS4's processor. I've actually gone into some of these previously, and if you're curious, you should check out the interview with Mark Cerny, and I actually go into quite a lot of depth of that. But there is also probably other revisions and so on that we're not that familiar with, as well as the actual clock speed of the CPU. They haven't actually publicized, I talk of Sony and Microsoft, although we believe Microsoft's CPU is running at 1.6 GHz, so we surmise that the PlayStation's is running around that type of speed. However, to get back to my original point, it's most likely that in this case it won't be too difficult to port them in terms of the very base code. Both are going to be using x86, and indeed that also bodes quite well for PC conversions as well. How well is very difficult for me to ascertain at this point. It really depends upon the API. Most likely they're going to make it as easy as possible. However, easy as possible isn't necessarily as easy as what simply pressing a button. But you've also got to take into account that despite the fact that porting processes are fairly easy, if what's said is true about the Durango, it could possibly be a little bit harder to get the most out of the system. However, Microsoft are not going for the jugular purely in gaming, and most likely they want to make the best entertainment package that they can possibly muster. So that's not just a combination of gaming. So it's possible that they calculated internally that, you know what, we know that this is going to set us back a little bit. Say 2 titles are launched and then a couple more titles will be released, say, 6 weeks later, for example, to use an arbitrary figure. But long term we're going to be a lot better off, because long term we feel that we have soldiered it. We feel that we have made the right decision. And that's the big deal right there. Right now, of course, these companies are playing, should I say, for keeps. They are not worried so much about a few initial titles. However, with that said, you cannot launch against a competitor if that competitor has a significantly better launch lineup than you. It's just a bad idea. I'll give you a pure example of this. Let's just assume, and once again, this is just pure conjecture and an example on my part. This is by no means fact or biased. I'm just merely creating an illustration. Imagine if, for example, the PlayStation 4 came out with, say, just for example, I don't know, 10 very, very good titles, and the Xbox came out with, say, 2 or 3 that you wouldn't mind playing. It's not a good look for the next generation Xbox, is it? Because most likely, unless you're a fan of the Xbox, if you're a caught on the fence type of person, which I've mentioned a couple of times, I actually have no loyalty between either. I actually love Xbox and PlayStation, and I know that may sound like I'm just saying that to the viewers, but it's actually really true, and I could give you a history of all the consoles I've owned, and I'd be here for quite a while, but suffice to say that I've owned the PlayStation and Saturns and the original Xbox and Xbox 360 I bought on launch, and I've loved my PlayStations as well. So, to be honest with you, I really am on the fence of which console I would buy. If I only was given the choice between one, I really would have to look at the launch lineup, and I think that's going to be the thing. Now, as I've said previously on RGT, I'm hoping to be able to buy both systems with some other bits and pieces as well. There's going to be a lot of equipment coming in over the next 6 months or so, most likely, and I will give you my opinions, because obviously some people only want to buy one, and that's not maybe even to do with their finances. It's just simply because they only want to buy one. This is especially true in, say, a family. You know, you might only want one, and in that case, it's very, very, very difficult to know from this news if Microsoft really are in trouble. However, it's worth noting that in terms of the actual hardware side of things as well, it seems that Sony seem to be a bit further along development. That's what various sources and various websites seem to be murmuring right now. And obviously, they are not naming themselves. It's not like, Tom Jones from, I don't know why I come up with that name, but anyway, from, say, EA has said, gone on record and say that yes, I prefer working on PlayStation 4 because it's much further along in hardware or whatever. Most likely they're also talking about, because they're also talking about the hardware and software side of things. That could also mean other things such as the API, which obviously is the application programming interface, or to put it into another perspective, the actual languages and the actual what's actually really there to actually tie the game to the console, in other words, to make it work. I'll just simplify it, and we really won't go into APIs today. But that could be DirectX, and Sony are very far along in this. They've actually gone on record, and they're almost being boastful, actually, on how adaptive this application is. And indeed, they actually believe that theirs is probably to the point where if you're not familiar with coding that well, then you could probably make a relatively decent game. You wouldn't be tapping into all of the raw power of the system. On the other hand, if you are more familiar with it, if you feel extremely comfortable with either x86 or whatever, then you can go ahead and bypass some of this stuff, or just use it as a groundwork. So, for example, you can say, oh, okay, I see where this is going. I can now go ahead and rewire this. It's kind of like, I don't know, if you see a plug, for example, or whatever, you just say, oh, okay, I see where this wire's gone. Okay, I can just, follow this. I don't know if you've ever, for example, changed a plug and the colors are a bit weird because, some person made the wires out of all the same color. I've had that once or twice on a random extension cords. And I think both wires were like black or something like that, and I was just like, okay, so I had to just basically take a note of what one went to one. And obviously this is far more complicated than that. I'm just merely using it as an example, of course. So there are a couple of other things as well. As I was saying earlier, Microsoft have recently cancelled several internal next generation projects. Now we're not actually sure what those are. It's most likely that they could be parts of the hardware. Obviously Microsoft right now are working heavily with Kinect, but then there's the whole Surface thing as well that Microsoft are supposedly trying to get together, and we're not really sure, to be honest with you, what Microsoft can be showing. Now, I know this may sound a bit doomy and gloomy, if you prefer, but it's worth noting that Microsoft have quite a lot of cash at their disposal. They are not a poor company. They are not in bad financial straits. In other words, it's quite possible that they could either buy the exclusives that they want, or they could simply give cash incentives to developers to say, hey, put this title on our system first and we will give you lots of money. The other option is they could simply buy in the developers. Now, some people may argue that the internal studios that work for Microsoft are, in terms of the raw talent, outnumbered by Sony and Nintendo. And you have an arguable point there. Some people have been worried for a while now that Microsoft themselves have been almost shooting themselves in the foot, because they believe that one of the reasons that the Xbox didn't just carry on its ruffle stomping of the PlayStation, which it did to begin with on the PlayStation 3 launch. I was actually keeping quite close eye on the sales numbers. I gave up after a while, of course, but to begin with, the Xbox was heavily outselling the PlayStation 3 because of the simple case of the games were just more. Which you expect, because A, the system was launched earlier, and B, the PlayStation 3's lineup was okay at the start, but it wasn't amazing. There were a couple of titles that I wanted. I believe Resistance was kind of close-ish to launch. I don't actually have the games list with me, but I think there was that, Virtual Fighter, a few other bits and bobs, but there you have it. Meanwhile, of course, at this point, Microsoft had already started to roll out the really big hitters. That's not to say that Microsoft's launch lineup was particularly great, but certainly after 6 months or so, the system was starting to hit its stride. However, some people believe that Microsoft started to, I wouldn't say slack, because that's a very negative word, and it doesn't really fit such a big company, but they certainly were, maybe dropped the ball a little bit. And some people even believe, some developers actually have criticized that Microsoft should have been more supportive to small developers. However, once again, other developers have gone on record and said that, you know what, Microsoft are being quite supportive. And then, of course, there's always the possibility that Microsoft are going to integrate the Windows Marketplace, or a version of it, into the next generation Xbox. Anyway, I think that's about it for this particular video. I think you'll have to do your own surmising on this one, and I know that's a bit of a tall order because it's not really that much information, so I think we're just going to have to wait and see. I don't think we're going to have a particularly awful launch, however, for the Durango. I think Microsoft have worked quite hard on it by now, so I don't think we're going to have an abysmal launch, although I do think it's possible that maybe they could have slightly worse games, or maybe not as many at least, as the PlayStation on launch. It's possible, and I'm talking about exclusives here as well. Obviously exclusives are the big system seller, because let's say you've got 3 exclusive on one system, 1 exclusive that you want to play on another system, but say 3 on another system you want to play and 1 on another, but then there's tons of third-party games that are available on both. It doesn't, you know, unless you have massive brand loyalty, or the titles, or the system only has 1 game, you see that in the release schedule there's like another 5 or 6 in the future that you really want, you're probably going to get the one with 3, at least I would. But obviously there are tons of other aspects to this as well. It's never really that cut and dry. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video, even though it's a bit all over the shop. So I will see you soon. Take care and bye for now.